Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We're going to get started in about 4 minutes time, just after the top of the hour. So we're going to start in about 4 minutes time on this call. Thanks everyone. Hello. Hi Daryl. Going to start just at the top of the hour. Welcome to everyone else joining as well. Shit. Christ. Hi everyone, just joining. We're going to give it about another minute or so just to let the last few people join, and then just after the top of the hour we'll get started on this call. Feel free during the call to introduce yourself in the chat on the right hand side. So down the bottom right hand corner you might see a button that says chat with everyone. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. It's also a good place later on the call to ask any questions you might want to ask. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes because there's lots of people still joining. And then after the top of the hour, we will get started. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today for today's Gemini Academy sessions. Just a quick introduction to get started. We're not going to do the timer. Welcome. I'm going to get to the intros. My name is Andy. I'm a Google certified trainer, and I also lead Google Certified Innovator Program. So I work with people across the world using Google for Education tools, particularly focused on the implementation of those tools into their organizations. I'm also joined today by my colleague Kat. Hi Kat.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you all. My name's Kat. I am a former teacher who is now head of community and inclusion at Canopy, which basically means I make friends with people and then look after them. I'm very lucky.
And Kat is sort of doing that today in our chat space. So Kat's going to present the sort of second half of today's call, but she's also going to help me in the first half by answering questions as we go along in the chat space. You've probably seen already on the bottom right hand side, you can access the chat window. I see Ron's being in there already, and some other people are just starting to pop up now doing introductions. But as we go through the call today, if you have any questions at all, feel free to pop them in the chat. And hopefully Kat will get to them and answer them, but we'll also at various points we'll pause and look for questions and allow a bit of time to answer them during the call. Right, let's get started and talk about what we're covering today. So we've just sort of done a bit of an introduction. In the first part of the call, we're going to talk a little bit about Google's Gemini and NotebookLM and streamlining operations. I'm going to do some demos of some tools featuring Gemini, talk a little bit about bias in that section as well. And then we're going to look at some responsible approaches to that. Kat, you're going to then take over and take us through Notebook. Oh, before that, I'm also going to show Workspace Studio, our newest tool. Then we'll have a quick top of the hour, about 1 hour in break for a few minutes, answer some questions, and then Kat's going to take over, take us through some NotebookLM areas, and then talk about questions, answers, certification at the end. So that is the plan for today. Thank you to everyone joining us as we go through. So be really interesting to find out at the start of this sort of what position people feel like. So I'm going to allow a moment for people to think about these three questions and maybe give us some responses in chat just before we get into the call itself. So what maybe it is that interests you most for AI, maybe your reasons for coming on the call today might be included in that. If there's particular things, particular features, particular topics that you really want us to cover today, now is a great time to get those into the chat as part of question 1. Or question 2, what your understanding of maybe of the AI tools like Gemini is at the moment, whether you're a very new to AI person or maybe you've got a lot of experience in this already, have used a range of tools and platforms. And then also maybe you want to think about what ways do you anticipate AI impacting higher education, particularly in the role you do. Now, today we're sort of focusing around sort of workflows and productivity, but I know in previous calls we've talked about some of the impacts on assessment, some of the impacts on delivery. So those are some things I want to think about at the start of the call today before we get into the topic in general. So if you want to let us know any of those things in the chat, what maybe interests you most about AI, what you want to get out of today's call, and what your understanding of AI is, maybe what you feel of Gemini at the moment, or what you've used of Gemini at the moment, and then how might AI impact your role. So any of those three questions in the chat, I'll have a quick look through those. At the same time, if anyone wants to come on and share verbally, this is also a moment to do that. Now, disclaimer before we do any verbal sharing, this call, like all our other calls, is recorded. If you come on camera and want to talk to us, that's absolutely fine. But disclaimer here, you will end up on the recording for obvious reasons. So if anyone wants to share verbally with us answers to these three questions before we get into the content today. So Kevin, who I know is sharing in chat at the moment, about Gemini making life easier and more productive for him, and how they work as an organisation. Thank you for sharing, Kevin, in chat.
Daryl here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, got you loud and clear, Daryl. Go for it.
Thank you. Clearly, I'm focused, like most people, on education, and particularly workplace education in Victoria, which was working for an RTO, a registered training organisation, which has that level above high school prior to university. And it has an enormous demand on compliance issues. My involvement with Gemini, well, I've spent some time sort of fussing around which one I'm using. I've settled on Gemini, particularly because I'm really impressed with NotebookLM, which gives some, in my last few weeks, I've been hitting it fairly intensively, and it's just been producing some amazing products. With the proviso, like all users of AI, you need to know what you're expecting to happen. And that's what I found when I gave it to a technician. He sort of said, oh, you sort of have to know beforehand what what the answer is almost. Yeah. But I find it really fascinating, particularly in the compliance assessment designing of assessment instruments, how it would be much more productive and release time for doing the actual teaching time and more creative thinking time. So it's and how it's impacting higher education, that's really one of the reasons I'm here, to find out what other people are saying.
Yeah, and
because
Daryl, thank you.
I'm on a bit of an island. Okay.
That's
Thank
fine,
you.
and thank you for sharing with us, and that's really good to hear. I think the bulk of people who are joining us on the call today are probably working with those older students. We've predominantly got a lot of university folk on the call today. Lots of other people, while you're explaining that, also adding in the chat. Lots of similar themes I'm seeing there. Kat coming through in chat as well. And our aim today is to give you that broad understanding of how some of these tools might help you. When you talk about some of the compliance pieces, particularly as we dig a bit later in, you already called out NotebookLM and the uniqueness around that product. And Workspace Studio is another one that might come into use as well. So a range of people on the call today from a range of different settings, and some names I know as well. So thank you everyone for sharing. And I know Kat will respond individually in the chat as we move through. Okay, just a few big broad pieces that we need to cover. You might have heard these on lots of Google calls already as we've gone through. We just want to make sure everyone has the same understanding of where Google products sit. So when you sign into Google for Education, using an education account, so whether that's your university account, where you are, or a college, or wherever you might be, if you are using Google Workspace for Education, then some key things apply. You're using a version of Gemini that we call Gemini for Education. And that means that Gemini isn't the same version as a public user with a Gmail account who just goes to gemini.google.com would see. It's the version of Gemini knows it's in a school, and that means it behaves slightly differently. In some respects, it's a bit more sensitive around certain topics, but it's also more generous. You get more access to Gemini 3 Pro than our standard users do. And so there are some differences. And just bear in mind, that's why we often refer to it as Gemini for Education, as being a dedicated version of Gemini. Alongside that, the admins of that organization can manage who has access to it. And that includes things like data reporting back into the system. So everything you do in Google Workspace across all the Google tools is always auditable inside a tool called Vault, and that's no different for Gemini. Thinking about data security in particular, when you use Gemini in your school accounts, your data stays private and secure. Your data is effectively your data. And so the big things that you need to be aware of is that Google don't use your data to train the model in any way, and no humans review your data. Your data isn't shared with anybody. We don't use the data for advertising. We let you control how that data is used, and the data is encrypted at rest and in transit from a security perspective. So it's down to you to decide the level of use of data inside AI. But from a Google perspective, your data stays private and secure. Different schools and organizations and universities will have different policies around where they feel it's appropriate to use AI, and also maybe what sort of data is put into AI. And obviously you need to follow your own organizational policies when you are using any of our tools, but that's where we sit from a data perspective. And it's really important, whatever tool you're using, you consider, where does my information go when I'm asking questions, when I'm putting data in. So things we're going to do today, some of the things we're going to do today, we're going to, later on in the call, Kat's going to take us through NotebookLM and using particularly around policy writing. I'm going to talk about using Gemini, particularly around administration tasks, focusing a bit more on gems in this session. We're also going to introduce you to Workspace Studio, the newest of our AI tools, and we'll talk a bit about the certification and how that fits in as well alongside this. So these are some of the aims of today's session. I don't need to write this in the chat. I think we probably all agree on this call that AI is all around us. There isn't almost a product now that I go into on the web where I don't see they've injected an AI, or I don't see a sort of a star to indicate that AI is all around us. Inside Google, that means it's appearing in lots of Google products that we use. A lot of you may be aware that how we search is now impacted by AI, and Google uses AI to serve answers more quickly in Google search. How we might create things and change things, not just from using Gemini, but in things like Google Photos. How we write with use of tools like Help Me Write inside Google Docs and inside Gmail. And also how we learn with tools like Google Lens to be able to find out information about the world around us. So not just by going to Gemini do we see AI, but we see it across a range of different Google products that exist on the web, and that's sort of growing. And if someone had asked me where do I think AI will be in years to come, my sort of feeling is it will get more embedded into the natural tools we're using. When AI first launched, it very much felt like you would go to an AI product, you go to Gemini and you get your AI and you come back again to where you were. And now what we're seeing is sort of a phase where AI is more embedded into the everyday tools we're using rather than being seen as a separate thing. So AI is obviously starting to surround us in the world around us. But one of our key feelings at Google, particularly in the education area, it isn't a replacement for what we're doing. We see AI as a partner that enables better use of human expertise. And there's a key term that we come back to a lot when we talk about the use of AI, and that is human in the loop. And in fact, some of our products are designed to almost prevent you from doing too much automation. And when we look at Workspace Studio a bit later, you'll see how there's certain things that you might want to automate that the product won't do because it requires a level of human oversight for its processing. So we'll see that as we go through today. But we think that the research is suggesting that the best place for AI is in what we call a brain first position. So brain first, thinking about things ourselves as humans, individuals, and then using the AI to supplement and power that to give us more focus, more capacity, more insight into what we're doing. So we are there, and most of the people joining us on the call today are joining us from higher education, post-16, post-18 education spaces. Google is obviously a core pillar of Google's strategy is around supporting this sector. And I would say it is the one sector where NotebookLM, as was mentioned earlier, is a sort of a core tool, being able to have AI that's focused on your own resources. So Google is committed to supporting all sectors, but in particular, it's that work within higher education. And DeepMind, Google's AI tool, was built out of that sector to help it expand in that area. Okay, so everything that Google does in AI is grounded around the core AI principles. And Google was one of the first companies to commit to this, which is where do we think the line should be around AI? And so when you're using the tools, it should follow these rules as a general rule. So things like avoid creating unfair or reinforcing unfair bias. I'm going to talk about bias a bit in the session. Being built and tested for safety, being accountable, privacy design principles, and that's why your data is not used for any reason. High standards of scientific excellence, and being clear when it's calling out something that it's not sure on, particularly if you ask for something like health information. And then be made available for uses that are core with those principles, and therefore we don't allow our AI to be used for certain things. And you'll find that if you ask it on certain topics, it may push back and say it won't answer. So those are Google's AI principles. So in terms of Google in AI in higher education right now today, where does it sit? Previous sessions have talked about some of our design evidence-based learning area and our security. Today, we're really focusing on the productivity piece. So we're focusing on this area here. But we also know that AI can be used to make learning more personalized, more accessible, and more adaptive to individual learners. And we might see a bit of that bubble through today. So that, and I know people have joined us on previous sessions, is our sort of generic introduction. We're going to focus in on two got 3 big tools today, but 2 have got big sessions. Gemini to start with, and then later on we're going to look at Google NotebookLM. So before we move on, Kat, any questions we haven't covered in the chat? Are we all good to move through?
No, I think we're all good so far.
Cool, thanks. And Kat will keep jumping in. If you've got questions, genuinely pop them in the chat. Happily take a diversion and jump into those. So we're going to talk a little bit about Gemini, and we're going to look at prompting. So I'm going to actually come out of my slides for a moment and go to my first demo of the day, head over to the web and head into Gemini. So I'm on the homepage of Google at google.com. Lots of different ways to get to Gemini. Just go to the picker. Now we all have nice new icons and go to Gemini. Gemini had a bit of a facelift about a week ago. I'm going to just switch accounts actually at this point to make sure I'm in my education account. Gemini had a bit of a facelift about a week and a half ago. So you might have seen now it's gone to the blue and some of the buttons have moved around. But I'm just going to quickly take you through some of the key things that we see on this page before we get into prompting. So when we're using Gemini, we can choose which mode we're in, whether we're in Flash, Thinking, or Pro mode. Flash is the fastest mode, giving an answer quickly. Thinking, we'll think about it a bit more. Pro, we'll spend the most amount of time thinking about it. If you're asking a complex scenario, so the other day I was giving Gemini a lot of data and I was asking it to analyze data from a variety of different spreadsheets. I turned that up to Pro mode to get a better response because I wanted it to focus on the accuracy of what it was doing. So choose the right mode, and over on the other side with the plus button, we might choose to do a couple of things. We might choose to give some additional information to Gemini to get more on topic, by uploading files, giving things from Drive, or linking in notebooks. Or we might choose to use one of these modes down here, guided learning, image, canvas, deep research, or music, to allow it to create specific content. Sometimes if you ask it to, it will still drop into one of those modes. So if I create an image, it will still most likely create an image without me pressing that button. But sometimes that can give it a push in the right direction. So we're here on the home page. We're going to obviously write a prompt. One of the errors we see a lot with people using generative AI is not putting enough detail in their prompts. And so when we think about what level of detail we need, there is an acronym that we use quite a lot, which is PARTS. And so PARTS stands for the following: persona, aim, recipient, theme, and structure. So when we're thinking about our prompt, we want to try and cover as many of these as possible. Persona is saying who we are. So I'm a university lecturer and I'm teaching a particular subject. So persona is the obviously probably the most important thing to cover. If you're only going to cover a bit of them, cover persona and aim. Right, the minimum you want to do is tell it who you are, and then tell it what you want out of it. What's the aim? What are you asking it to produce? Those are the minimum things you need to cover. In addition, you might also want to cover the recipients. Who is it writing for? So if it's writing for a particular audience, if you're trying to produce something, and this is for undergraduate students, or it's postgraduate students, or maybe it's a wider audience, it's a piece of marketing for university, you might want to tell it that, because otherwise it tends to be quite text heavy. You might always want that. The theme, what topic, what additional information can I give it? Can I give it a document, a source? And then the structure, what do I want it to be? Is it, remember, I can produce images, I can produce slides, I can produce documents, I can produce text. I've got to tell it what I want. And so thinking through these topics as you prompt Gemini will help you get a better response. There are loads of other frameworks out there for prompting, lots of different ways of doing it, but these ones are the ones I sort of use as we prompt the model. So a couple of questions have come in on the chat that I'm going to answer now because they relate to this, because there's a question first. Is giving the AI role researcher, teacher, examiner helpful with prompting? It's useful to help it know what position it's writing from. So it doesn't necessarily mean it makes it any more knowledgeable in that topic, but what it means is it writes it from the right perspective. So if I was to ask it to write an introduction to a university lecture, let's say, or to give me some ideas how I could introduce a new topic to undergraduate students, if I'm telling it that I'm the deliverer of the course as opposed to one of the students, it would write that in a different perspective, in a different way. So it's important to give it that role. So I would say, in answer to your question, yes, it does make a difference if it knows what role it is. Just looking back to other questions that we've got coming at the same time. I saw a question earlier about can you use Google Pro on any Google Workspace for Education account? We have Plus. So using Pro mode in Gemini is available to all Google Workspace for Education users, including those on what we call our fundamentals tier, which is the free tier. So even if you don't pay Google for your Workspace accounts, you still have access to Pro model if you're in an education account. However, as you move up through the different tiers that are available, you get more use of that Pro tool. So you get increased usage. So Renee, that's answered it for your question. While we go, I think then somebody asked about using data analysis. And checking the outputs. Elizabeth makes a really good point about, and this is somebody actually that came up earlier as well, which is, have you got the knowledge to know if it's correct? And can you know that that is the case? Are we asking questions where we've got the knowledge and the experience to know? And I'll talk a bit about that in terms of prompting as we come into that now. So, parts framework. And so we might break a prompt down into those sections. So here's an example of that, asking it to behave as a science person with a focus on sustainability. I'm giving it my subject context in this space. Then I'm asking it the aim. What do I really want out of it? So there's a minimum. You need to be doing these top two sections here. But then explaining who it's for first-year university students. The tone should be conversational, engaging, and clear in structure. So that prompt is quite lengthy, but giving it a lengthy prompt avoids any potential issues with bias or with Gemini not understanding the topic you want. So that's the parts framework. Now let me just go a little bit and talk about using such a framework inside Gemini, because it's great for me to say that, which is keep using the same frameworks, but of course that means over here I end up writing the same thing over and over again. So I might in here, by the way, you can voice type into Gemini, and I'm going to be voice typing in today. So I might say, I'm at university delivering a module on geography for first-year undergraduate students looking at river formations. Can you suggest some ways of introducing this topic to the students? So this is just me asking Gemini for some advice. I gave it a scenario, and it's given me a response in this case. So I gave it a prompt, voice typed the prompt in, got a response back in terms of the content that I could use here for that area. It's given me some ideas. Now, of course, I'm the human in the loop. I'm the subject specialist. So I'm the person that's going to know which of these are appropriate. I also know my students. So maybe I've met them before, I've delivered to them before, what would be appropriate. So there's a whole lot of other factors in play here. And that's when we come back to that human in the loop piece. One of the things you'll notice I ask for there, and I think is really key when we're using AI, is very often when I use AI, I ask for a range of examples. I'll ask for more than one answer. I often ask for over generation. So when I want it to generate 10 questions, sometimes I'll ask for 20, and then I'll go through and I'll pick the ones I want, keeping me as a human in the loop, but also allowing me to pick from a range rather than being reliant on one thing. So that is a key tip when we're using this. But of course, writing I'm a university lecturer all the time can get repetitive. And that's why we want to introduce to you the concept of gems inside Gemini. So here I am in Gemini, and on the left-hand side, I'm just starting new chats every time. But on the left-hand side menu, a bit further down, we have a gems area. When you first go to gems, you'll see there are some pre-built gems here that Google have written that help you produce particular content inside Gemini. But you can also write your own gems. And that's the important part. You can write your own gems by going to new gem that allow you to give Gemini the same information to use each time. So if you find you're coming back to Gemini 2, 3, 4 times to do the same thing over and over again, that should probably be a gem. So if we go over here into gems, we have to give each gem a name. So I might want to make a gem that's subject specific for the subjects that I'm teaching. So I might call this a subject expert gem or subject expert gem. And for this case, I'm going to stick with my subject of geography. And then down here, I got a space where I can just briefly describe what my gem is, and that's just to help me really. Doesn't really change it, but I mean, I've got lots of gems. I can see the brief description. So this makes Gemini, oops, oops, capital C, makes Gemini a subject expert. And then down in here, down here, I can put in a more detailed prompt of what exactly I want Gemini to do. Now, this prompt is effectively used every time before the rest of my text in this particular box here. So in this example, I might say, you are a subject expert on physical geography working at a university. Now, at this point, that's a very brief prompt, right? I probably want to give it a lot more detail. And if I had the time, I would go through and give it all the relevant background information I felt it might need to be able to produce things more particular to me. And now in those instructions, I could also talk about the sort of outputs I want, about the style of writing, whether I want long text, short text. I can give it these instructions that will apply every time we use this particular gem. When you're writing a gem, when you're creating a gem, there's a button here you can use, which allows you to Gemini to analyze what you put and potentially improve it. I don't know whether it'll be able to improve the one I've written because I didn't really write enough. But what this will do is it will be able to look at my content and just think about what I've written there and improve the output. So on the right-hand side now, and I probably made an error in starting that running, I can ask it questions. When I go into gems and I run my subject expert gem, it's got all the pre-built parts of that framework in there. So I would say that gems, getting used to gems, saves you a lot of time because you don't want to be writing all the time, your job and your title and everything else. So very early on, if you're using Gemini, start thinking about using gems with it to give it that context to where you are and where you work. It hasn't really changed at all. It's left exactly the same. But now when I ask it questions over here, it will behave like that. Now, just to mention a couple of other things about gems, you can also give it knowledge. So I can give that gem particular knowledge. I could give it my course syllabus. I could give it a breakdown of the module I teach or any particular specific content. So I can make it more of an expert and ground it more in my own course by giving it those additional files. And then either allowing it to cite or not cite the information I give it. You'll notice here now you can also link it to NotebookLM. So you can use a gem that has the knowledge of a notebook from NotebookLM. And Kat will introduce NotebookLM later, but just when she does, bear in mind that you could then feed that through into a gem and use it inside Gemini in a gem. So, so let's have a quick, there's a couple of questions coming in. Elizabeth asked a question already about gems, so it seems the perfect time to answer it. She said, I tried creating a gem to help with reviewing and doing quality checks on module material. When I tried to use it, I was not able to upload all of the PowerPoints, which form part of the module kit. Is there a limit to what you can upload? So there is a prompt. So this could actually happen in main Gemini as well, not just in gems. There is a limit to the size of the information you put in the prompt box. And so when you press the plus button here, we can upload things. There's a limit to the file size, and it's not just the file size, but it's also the amount of characters, the amount of words in it, because it all becomes part of the prompt. So there's a limit to that. Now, bear in mind, if your gem over here on the left-hand side has a lot of knowledge attached to it, that's all going in on top of the things that you upload over here. So if this is very heavy on knowledge files, then you've obviously reduced the amount you can potentially put in over here. So in terms of some tips there, Elizabeth, for doing that, what I would say, a couple of things, and there's a couple of first little tricks, a way around it. Firstly, and I don't know whether you want to do this with all your PowerPoints, but the PowerPoint file type is quite large to start with, but PDF and slides are smaller. So if you're trying to just do the task and it just won't work because the PowerPoint's too big, you can always PDF it out or turn it to slides and put that in. That will get you around a certain amount of leeway. And bear in mind, you can do that on the left-hand side as well. If you've got a lot of PowerPoints over here that tend to be big files, put them as PDFs, make them smaller, which will give you more room over here. So you can play around with it that way. It's quite a big limit. So you have to be putting some quite big stuff in to hit it. But that, Elizabeth, hopefully answers your question. It's probably useful for anyone else to understand that there are limit sizes to how much data you can feed into a single prompt window. Great question. So it's gems inside Gemini, and doing that piece there. And actually, maybe I'll use your PowerPoint to do something else as an example in a minute, because there could be something we could do with this. So we've been talking about the parts framework. What I want to do next, actually, I might come straight over. How are we doing on time? I am
You're only half an hour in. You're good.
cool.
I was just going to say, I've just dropped into the chat a gem for the parts framework that Louise has made, which should be open for everyone to use. So that means you can just click on that, put in your prompt, and it will improve it using the parts framework for you.
Yeah, and this is a great example of a gem that does something, and it sort of brings together the two things we talked about already. So I can take my really bad prompt from earlier. Maybe I should grab my prompt from earlier that I used when I asked the question about I've lost the question there. When I asked the question about subject content, let's have a look at that. So if I go to, you can always get back to your old chats by opening the sidebar and going to the topic here, and you can get your conversation back. So I'm going to go and copy that I used earlier, put it into the prompt gem. And what this will do is it will improve the prompt to meet the parts framework. So feel free to click on that link to use that gem. And it's now, as you see, done me a PARTS prompt here that I can use to feed that information in to the gem. So it improves your prompting no end. A really useful way of getting used to getting into prompts really quick, and also good when you're building gems to put it through this, so that your gem prompt meets the parts framework as well. Thanks for sharing that, Kat, and reminding me. Someone asked a follow-up question on that. Will linking the NotebookLM help with the file limit? Yes, it will, because it's seen as one link, so it is useful. Okay, back we go into talking about let's go back to the slides from here, and then we're going to look at Studio in just a second. Kat, remind me of that example, because I think we could do PowerPoint to slides as a Studio. I think we might be able to build what Elizabeth's doing as a Workspace Studio Flow. So we can also, when we're using prompts, sometimes use the parts framework. So we've got that example there. So we can also sometimes use multiple prompts together in a conversation flow to get the desired output. So sometimes you might ask a series of questions. Remember, it's not necessary to cover all of your prompting in the first prompt. It might come through a series of conversation, and then you end up with this conversation that's saved on the left-hand side for you to be able to access. So chaining multiple prompts together sometimes is really useful. It breaks it down into steps, makes it easier for Gemini to respond to each step, and moves you towards the output of the thing you need. So in this example here, explaining who we are first, getting an example, then asking it to frame the initiative in a certain way, then looking at the audience in a certain way, and then asking it to focus on one. So breaking multiple prompts chained together is sometimes a way of doing that. And also Elizabeth's example, it might also allow you to put more content in, give it more detail as you go. And then you can ask Gemini. If you don't know how to do something, you can ask Gemini for help. And sometimes when I'm prompting Gemini, I might ask it to ask me a question first. So you can ask Gemini to ask you questions. So I might say to Gemini, before you do this task that I'd like some help with, please ask me 3 relevant questions. And Gemini will then ask you 3 questions about the task before generating the output. This can be really useful because one gives me some control over the output. Secondly, if I don't know much about the topic, it helps sort of give me some choice in that topic. If I'm asking it to help write a policy or write some guidelines, then that might be something I'll say, well, ask me some questions first and help me work in partnership to help me develop something. So remember, we can always go further with prompts by asking Gemini to ask us questions. And we'll share the slides with you after this session. They'll be on the notes that we follow in the follow-up email we send. But these are some useful prompts you can use. Things like explaining me like I'm that person, asking for analogies, give me the pros and cons, asking to look at both sides of an argument sometimes can be useful. Transforming things into different areas or creating tests from content are all spaces where you might want to lean into, ask Gemini to do those sort of tasks. So, talked a little bit about just prompting there. Now let's get into the sort of the meat of what we're talking about today, which is, can we use Gemini to streamline things, to help us with some of the flows and processes that we do all the time. I've already sort of explained Gemini to you, so we've seen these buttons before as we've gone in and had a look already. But Gemini can do a whole variety of tasks to help us sort of streamline what we're doing, whether that's through researching and using tools like deep research, whether that's through enhancing academic writing, helping you structure content and rewrite content, or whether it's about personalized learning assessment. So let's come out and have a look at some of those tools inside Gemini. So I'm going to take you through these tools, but I'm going to show you them inside Gemini itself. I'm going to move this out of the way so we can look at each one. Let's start a new chat. So the first thing we might want to do inside Gemini is think about how we could know if the answer is relevant. So when we've got an answer, how do we know where that information came from? So let's go back to my rivers information here. Obviously, it's produced this content here. It's given me these different ideas, but I might want to know, where did it get the information from? I might want to ask it to double check the responses. So double check the response really asks it to focus in on what you've put and tell me, in terms of what you put, where the content came from. Where, is it valid? Is it relevant? And the source is important. So as you can see, what you'll do there is it will highlight different areas of this. Now, I might not pick the best example because I don't think it's highlighted much. Let me see if it's highlighted. Oh, it's highlighted bits where there is information. It's able to link to the sources of where that is from. So if we're thinking about what evidence did you use? Where did you get that idea from? Why did you think this was an important topic to include at this point? It's explaining where it found that information from. So it's sourcing its websites. To be able to do that, we go down here to the three dots. We hit double check response. We're asking it to go back through and check the response to give us that information. So double checking responses. Next key thing to help us when we're using Gemini is if there's a conversation that we want to use a lot. You'll notice I've got some conversations pinned on the left-hand side here. I can hit the three dots and I can pin the conversation to my side, which means I can come back to it time and time again. If this is a topic I'm working on, I need to continue this conversation at future points. Be able to pin it over there is important. So pinning the conversation. In terms of exporting the content out, a few different ways I can get this content out of Gemini. So there is obviously a copy button here, just to copy out the response to paste it somewhere else. Or through the three dots button, you'll notice I get the option here to either go to Google Docs if you use Google Docs, or Gmail if it's an email, to push the content somewhere else. So I can either bring it out copy and paste style, or I can bring it out in a document format. If I'd asked it to produce a table, it would give me the Google Sheets option as an export format. This is obviously text, not table format. So that is that area. Oops. Next up, in terms of the being able to add content in, remember when we add content, we can also add things like handwriting in. We can add written notes in. When we're giving this upload files area, it doesn't just have to be things that are in digital format. We could go analog to digital from the upload area to move things in that way. So what we talked about there is just some of the key sort of areas inside Gemini that we might want to use when we're doing that. One last one I'm going to just show you on the slides because it doesn't show as well on the screen when I do it live, is we also have a version of Gemini called Gemini Live. This works best on mobile, but it allows me to point my camera at various content and ask questions of Gemini. Gemini Live is now part of Gemini for Education, so it works now in our education versions. Obviously, it works best if you're on a mobile device, but it allows me to interact with the environment around me, ask it questions. So I've got some in this example here. I've got some work that's written on a board or some content from somewhere. I can interact with it and I can ask questions and Gemini will respond. It usually responds in audio, so it speaks the answer back to you. But then also when you come off Gemini Live, there's a recorded transcript of what you asked it. So it's in sort of both formats. So Gemini Live is another way of interacting quickly. If you've got something on the fly you want to put into Gemini to get content in, you can do it that way. So those are some key Gemini features that we might want to think about when we think about productivity. Before I talk about Canvas, I think this is about the point where I'm going to, before I go to Canvas, I'm just thinking about what I'm going to go to. Actually, I'll do Canvas first, then I'll do Studio. So we'll be conscious of my time here. Got a little bit of time to show Canvas, then I'll show Studio. Okay, so inside Gemini, we also have an area called Canvas. And Canvas is our space to create content, whatever you might be asking for. You can ask Gemini to create specific document types. So I could say to Gemini, and I know this prompt won't be the greatest, I might say, create a set of slides to introduce undergraduate students to the concept of glaciation. And because I asked Gemini to create a set of slides, that will use the Canvas module. So in a minute, it will think about this for a little bit. It will kick in, the screen will sort of go halfway over. It's because it's going slow because I'm doing a live demo. And I was doing it that way. It's doing it in slides instead, straight off into slides now. So this is one of the newer features where it does straight in slides instead of doing it in Canvas. I might go again. I'll show you coding in Canvas in a minute, but it's creating my slides for me. Let's leave that running, open a new window, go again. This time I'm going to press the Canvas button because I want it to build something specific for me this time. So Canvas can also be used as a coding space when we want to create in HTML code little tools. Whether that's a quiz, a really short end of unit quiz, or something much bigger, we might choose to do that. So I might say, in this case, we're going to, let's have a think of an example. We're going to build a selection tool for my website where students have to select a module to study from a choice of 4 modules. So what I might want to build is a sort of little interactive selection piece. Maybe students have got some options within your subject area, and you want them to be able to go on and look at what those options are. Maybe some rules around those options where you can't pick certain things. Maybe some objects, some units block against others. I've seen people with really complex structures of student choices, and you might want to build a little tool to enable you to do that. So you can see what's happening now is it still says it's in this module selection tool. It's starting to create this as an app for me to be able to use. So I've got the code coming up and also the preview window that will be in play in a moment. Now, I didn't at this point ask it to save the data from that, but that's another step. I could go back in and I could ask it to save the data once it's finished. While that's generating, let's go back to my slides, see if they're finished. 2 things going on at once now. So this is created inside Canvas, this introduction to glaciation deck that I asked for. So this is the Canvas window again here. And as you can see, it's got some content in the background. So it's created images in my slides. In terms of where does it get the images from, it goes to 2 places. Often it will find publicly usable images from the web. So they're not all created by AI. Some of them are genuinely royalty-free images from the web. And sometimes if there isn't something in there, it might go and create something for me. So it might create an image in its own knowledge where that doesn't exist. So that was the slides creation. That's a nice example. Let's produce. Let's see if my app is still building over here. To answer the question, I think, about what language does it code in, you can specify if you wanted a certain language. I think it's probably like to use HTML for my little web tool because it's a website tool, but you can specify. So here it's created this little portal. Here are my modules. I can select the module. I can put my information in down here. It's created this interactive element, which I could then take the code. Oh, this actually is React for this code. Take the code and import it to wherever it is I need to do. Now, I might not want it in React, so I might go back to it and say, please recode this in HTML. I can ask it to recode it in another language. So Canvas is a way of using both. I can use it both to create content, slides, documents, but also for tools like this to speed up data collection and build process tools like that. And then Elizabeth asked a really good question about branding, and what Elizabeth would like is the slides to be on brand when she produces them. And the simple answer to the slides on brand, Elizabeth, is at the moment it doesn't specifically produce slides on brand, but you could, in theory, in a prompt, explain what it is you want your slides to look like. So we always have an introduction slide. We always use this font. You could, in theory, build a gem or use Workspace Studio to do that piece. So that hopefully my answer, but there is more to come on that, Elizabeth, because I know a lot of people have requested on-brand slides from Gemini, and I know Google are working on a better solution. And someone asked the question, can they embed the code in Google Classroom? You can't embed this code straight into Google Classroom, but what you can do is you can take the code, put it in Google Sites, and then link that site in Google Classroom. So you copy and paste the code to Google Sites and put the site in Google Classroom. Okay, we've looked a little bit at Canvas there. Now I want to move over and introduce a new tool that you may or may not have seen, which is called Workspace Studio. It would be great to know in the chat if this is a tool that you have used before. So could you give me any, with the emoji buttons down the bottom of the chat, you'll see some emojis. Can you give me a thumbs up if you have seen Workspace Studio before, and thumbs down if you haven't? I'm seeing what we're getting in terms of ups. We've got a few ups and a few downs. Lots of ups, which is great to see. So Workspace Studio launched about just before Christmas this year, and is a new tool inside Google Workspace that sits alongside Google Gemini and NotebookLM. But Workspace Studio is about what we call agentic data flow. So it's still using Gemini, but this is about automating some processes using Gemini. Now, through all of these processes, we need to maintain, and the tool is built around the concept of human in the loop. And what we mean by human in the loop is that it won't just automate a process where we're not involved. And you'll see that as we go, as we take you through these tools, you'll see what we mean by human in the loop. So let me start with a really nice simple flow. Every flow inside Workspace Studio needs a trigger, something that makes it start. So I've got my first example here. I'm going to go to a brand new flow, and I'm going to create a trigger when I get an email. Now let's imagine I'm working at a university, I'm working in admissions, and the email address like admissions will get a large quantity of emails asking very similar questions. So you probably in your organization have these sort of inboxes, sometimes generic inboxes, or maybe you're unlucky enough that it's your own inbox that just gets lots and lots of emails that are very similar, that you know, got similar responses. So the email arrives, and it's the arrival of the email that triggers this process to run. So when an email comes in my inbox, I can then have some things that happen. Now, at this point, I might not want to do this to every email. I might want to have use some of these check ifs or use some filters. But ultimately, what I might do is I might ask Gemini to look at the email and see, it says, but this is the default one, summarize the email to 2 sentences. Well, I don't want to do that. I'm going to ask it to write a reply to this email. And then at that point, I'm giving it the body of the email as part of the prompt to look at. Now, you'll notice that below this, I have some options where I can use everything, or I can link it to specific sources, or I can use both. So I can link it to things in my Google Drive. So if I'm dealing with the admissions inbox at university, I might want to link it to the documentation about admissions. Maybe we've got some policies, maybe we've got prospectus from our university, maybe we've got a process somewhere that explains it, to make sure that when Gemini is answering this email, it's not just answering it based on a generic sort of Gemini response, that we're a bit like we would with Notebook, we're grounding it in our own material, we're using specific sources for it to be able to get the answers from. So we're asking Gemini to write a reply to that email. Then we might add a nice simple step, which is we want it now to go back to Gemini. As you see, we can't make it send the email. The most we can do is draft it as a reply to that particular image code. Sorry, didn't do that. We're going to go to Gmail again. We're going to draft a reply, which is what we should have done because we want it to reply to the original email, using what it knows about our topic and our syllabus and the content from that Gemini step to draft a reply to this particular email. Now, in this Gemini prompt box, you can write a much more detailed response than just write a reply. You can write about who you are, some of the concepts, some of the things that you might put in a reply. Maybe you've got links to certain resources you want to provide. You can write a really detailed prompt in there. But ultimately, what this allows you to do is when emails arrive in your inbox, we're going to just add in here the content from the previous step, so we'll add that there. when your emails arrive, they appear in your inbox, a reply is written. Now, that reply won't be perfect. You might still need to go in and change that reply, but it won't get it right for every email. But particularly on generic inboxes like admissions, there will be a big percentage of the responses where it will be accurate because it's based on the source material from your website, from your policies. So it will get an accurate response, and you'll be able to look at that, assume in the loop, check that the content is correct, and press send. What it is a lot more than the no reply that you had before this process was operating. So that's an example of a simple flow. But let me show you another one, and I'm going to use the example because I thought it might be relevant that I think Elizabeth asked earlier, where she was going to try and use Gemini to do quality checks on materials. And I think you could probably do this with a flow. So let's come back in and start a new flow. Remember I said starters can be lots of different things. And so starters could be, in this case, when an item is added to, sorry, that's the wrong one. Don't want that one. Let me go back again, replace it. I think for this one, I think what you need is when an item is added to a folder. Because what you could then do is create a folder for the material that you want to review or change or whatever it is you're going to do with that material. So as soon as that PowerPoint or whatever it might be, or slides, is dropped into that folder, it's going to trigger this process to run. Then we might have Gemini do something, but you'll notice here we can also use NotebookLM. So we can also use NotebookLM if we're looking at maybe evaluating the content against certain criteria. We might want to then go to NotebookLM and use a trained notebook that understands the criteria that we're looking for. So we don't have to use Gemini. We can also use Notebook within our flow process. So the file's going to go in. We're going to look at it and maybe make some judgment on it, make some comment on it. I suppose the question then is, what do we want to do with that information now we've found out, made a judgment on that slide? Lots of different outputs we could do with this. We might want to create a document, like a feedback document about, like, we've reviewed your material and here's 3 changes that we recommend. We might want to, depending on what you use, we might want to go to something like Google Chat and ping a message in chat to someone saying, we've reviewed your content, here's some changes we recommend. Or we might want to draft an email to a person who submitted that document or submitted that file. So what you do with it is sort of your choice here. There's lots of ways of giving that information back. So this is a nice flow where we do that process as well. Other examples for the flow with a folder is, bear in mind, we could also ask Gemini to translate content. So we could put, let's say, documents into a folder here, have Gemini translate, and then produce a new document and put that in a different folder or somewhere else. So we could use Workspace Studio to build something that might help us translate. We could use Studio to help us evaluate maybe against certain criteria. I know this is one of Kat's favorite topics, but we could look at content up here and we could study it against accessibility. So we could look at what someone's produced as maybe some slides to use at university and say, is this accessible to all our learners? Does it meet certain accessibility guidelines? I know in certain areas of the world there are strict frameworks for accessibility, but we could give Gemini that knowledge and ask it to evaluate what's been put in there against that framework. So you can start to see, as your minds are whirring, you could build all manner of flows based off some of these triggers. Last little example I will show you is the last sort of trigger for flows, and one that I use quite a lot is basing it off a Google form. So obviously we can build a Google form that collects information. That information comes in. We might then choose to do something with that form information, but you'll notice we've got the option here in the tools to create these sort of check if steps. So we can actually branch the data that comes in from the Google form. So maybe we've got a form that we're using at university and we ask the question, do you require help with accommodation? And the students obviously answer yes or no to that. So we can then do a check if they answered yes to this. We're going to run a particular flow process. Maybe we're going to create some emails about accommodation or notify someone in that team. And obviously if they say no, that particular action step is not going to run. It's going to just move on to the next step. So we're able to create this branching logic within the flows as well. We don't have to do that. And just to be completely up to date, Google, as you know, continually improve the products that we use. And this morning, this isn't live yet. I can't demo this because it's not live in the product yet. But this morning, Google announced there is now the ability to do something called Loop inside Workspace Studio, which means we can have it move through a process multiple times. And the best way of thinking about that is, imagine if we had a spreadsheet with lines of data in, we could have it go and complete a process for each line of data. So, go and email this person, go to the next line, go and draft to email to that person, and so on the way through. So this concept now of looping within the flows launched this morning. That won't be live yet in everyone's product. It will be coming over the next 14 days or so. But the repeat step is new into Studio, launching today. So that's a very quick overview of Workspace Studio. I'm going to pause now, actually, and head back to my question slide because we're at the question point as we get halfway through. And give a small moment, because I've talked at you a lot there. Give a small moment, one, for any questions, and also for a small break. So we're going to sort of pause for 3 minutes or so, allow you time to put questions in the chat, and myself and Kat will answer the questions. And if you want also a 3-minute break, Kat will start in about 3 minutes time or so on the next bit, which is NotebookLM. Any questions I've missed, Kat, in the interim?
No, we had a question I think I've answered on behalf of Daryl. I don't know, Daryl, have I managed to help you with what you're asking?
Yes, that's all good.
Thank you.
It means I orientate myself to Notebook when I don't want outside. Yeah,
outside source is cool. So Elizabeth,
there's one about from Hong Nung. Why does NotebookLM take longer to respond compared to other AI tools?
I share it, but that might depend on the amount of material you've given it. I suppose it's part of the answer there. It's grounding in the material. It could just be that's doing it. Is it possible to create triggers, or ask the Gemini Studio to create triggers? So in terms of that was a Studio question. Let me just have a quick look at something. I'm just going to quickly check something out now to see where this feature is. I know there is definitely a lot more coming to flows. I don't know whether we've
there's a big send feedback button on flows.
There is a big send feedback button on flows, but I do know that, I think I'm allowed to say this, that the team were looking about webhooks. If you know much about the way the internet works, we're able to trigger by external webhook as well, and that's possibly coming at some point. It's because of uploaded resource.
Interesting. I've never noticed it being particularly slow. It is when it's generated resources.
I think, definitely when it generates like images and things, it's slow. I think with the chat, I think it probably is, I would agree, slightly slower perhaps than Gemini in flash mode. But I suppose the answer to that is it's not necessarily using flash mode. So Steve asked a question about the fact that Studio is very much embedded at the moment inside Google Workspace. It is. There are a small number of external connectors, and I think Google are working on that over time, Steve. I know they've added some what I would call very commercial connectors at this point. Things like they've added things like Salesforce and MailChimp, which obviously are for the business world. I imagine we'll see more third-party integrations into Workspace Studio over time. And there are APIs potentially coming. Considering the human in the loop process, what should you do? What if I want the Studio to process an input from a form and then email the user both response? So at the moment, it wouldn't send the email because the email would stop because of the human in the loop rules around that. And that is a feature, I suppose you could say, Workspace Studio. It requires human inputs, won't just automate, and therefore you'd probably use. And I know a lot of people have used external tools for these sort of automations in the past. I know people like N8N or Pabbly or If This Then That. There's quite a few tools out there, but at the moment the human in the loop rule would override, so you'd have to check it.
I mean, it does just put it into your drafts, so you can just flick through and send them, which is what I do.
Yeah, you can do that. I mean, the other one, weirdly, is it will notify straight off in chat, but it will only notify the user who's running the flow. So it won't notify somebody else in chat. So I think we've answered those few questions coming in.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, give him a, is Workspace Studio only the web version? Yes, Workspace Studio is a web-based tool, so it's only on web. Studio.workspace.google.com is the link for it. I'll put the link in the chat because everyone needs to know it. Workspace Studio, when it first launched, was turned off by default. So if when you go to it, you don't have access, it might be something you need to talk to your IT department about. But yeah, it is a web-based tool. Because it sits on our platform. Ooh. I think, Kat, that might nearly be the end of the question section. Do we want to mention the certification now?
So someone else said earlier they didn't get a form, they didn't get a certificate from the previous session. You must fill in this form. That's an automated process as far as I'm aware. So you have to submit on the form. On this form, you can go back and fill in the previous ones. So if you didn't get a certificate from a previous session, you can, on the drop down, select the previous one. So if I just hop on to that one quickly, I'm going to bring in my screen at this point. That one. So you can see here on the drop down, you can choose which session, and you can start doing that form now if you want. You can't finish it until the session is over. So please don't try and finish it until the session is over, but you can start filling this in now if you want to. And I will just quickly drop in the chat the link for that one as well, just so you've all got it. If I can find the right link, that one there. Oh, Andy's already done it. He's beat me to it. Fine, be like that. Okay. So in that case, I get to take over. So I'm stealing the screen. So we're going to look a bit more about bias before we go any further, because we know that AI has an underlying issue. So it's worth just stressing that. And I'm a bit of an accessibility nerd, and I think that in terms of accessibility, it's really important that we talk about bias and hallucinations and all that kind of thing. So obviously, as we've already discussed briefly, Gemini is trained on a lot of data that's found on the internet. And of course, we know that the internet has its own underlying biases. So that means it's not a perfect system. It's based on the training data it's using. And I know Google are actively working to reduce and mitigate that bias. But you've got, as a user, it's really important that we are aware of that. And of course, then that obviously leaks into any uses within education that those biases may be there. So it's important that you as faculty members are thinking about that bias when you're using AI, when your students are using AI. So we're just going to have a look through. I love this graphic on this, by the way. It's quite hypnotizing for me. I can just stare at it over and over again. So we know that chatbots generate inaccurate information, and it's sort of categorized into those three different types. So for example, they may invent a statistic or a fact and fill in gaps. We quite often see in AI that if it doesn't have enough information on a topic, it will literally just make something up that sounds about right. And some of it appears very plausible. I'm sure you've all heard there was a case where somebody booked a holiday and whatever AI they'd used told them they didn't need a visa, but actually they did, because AI had just sort of filled in the gaps and said, yeah, I think you do need a visa. You don't need a visa. And so, yeah, it's really important that you're aware of that. Faulty logic. And I was mentioning earlier that sometimes I forget to start a new chat. And because my role involves working across a wide range of ages, I might be working on something for primary school, then ask a question that's relevant for university, and it will give me a primary school answer, because it's made that sort of logical leap between the fact that I'm talking about primary school, therefore I want my following answer to be about primary school. So it's that important idea of understanding that sometimes the logic in the chatbot can be wrong, whether that's because of something you've already done or because just the logic within the system is there. And then my favorite one is when Gemini makes up fake citations. And obviously it's not just Gemini, it's any chatbot. And it's that whole idea that it's searching the internet, it's got all this data, and it sometimes gets confused because it's not a real person, it's not a human, it's a machine. And so the citations sometimes just go completely crazy. So those sort of three inaccuracies are really important to bear in mind, both for yourself as faculty members and for the students you're working with, and to make sure that they know all about those things. So I've got a little example here. You can see the example we're using is the scientific name for a plant. So where it's sort of used that faulty logic idea that the ZZ is a repetition of the same word, when actually it's got, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce those words because I am not a biologist. But if you look down here at the bottom of it, you can see that it's actually should be Zami, yeah, that, not the repeated word. So just things to be aware of. And obviously we talked about the human in the loop. It's just that important. Check the answers, check the responses. You are responsible for checking what AI said to you. I can't stress enough how important it is that AI is not doing thinking for you, but then you're all probably perfectly aware of that. But again, we need to stress that for our students. It shouldn't be doing any thinking for us, and anything it gives us should be checked. So yes, it speeds things up, but we still need to take those precautions. So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to think about how you can think about within your institution how to address bias. You can see we've given you a few examples here. So for example, make sure you're critically evaluating systems, make sure you're keeping an eye on them, especially as the models change. So I mentioned earlier, Gemini is trained up to the point of its latest model. So whatever data is used to train it is true up to a certain point. Now, Gemini does also search the web, but it's not been trained on that information. So that's a slightly different way it uses that data. So as the model updates, you need to be aware of that and check and do your own checks within it. Obviously, it's really important that you have inclusive teams. You know, we talk about the fact that women's medicine is quite often done by white men. You know, why is that the case? And we need to make sure that when you're doing evaluation of AI, are you thinking about including the people who might be biased against for reasons of their gender, their race, any other reason? So make sure you're doing that inclusion. And also just making sure your students are thinking critically when they're working and using AI. And of course, that advocacy piece. So what do you think? I'm just going to give you a few minutes to either speak out loud, put your answers in the chat, whatever you think is a good idea for addressing bias. Goodness, people are leaving as soon as I start talking. Okay.
I tend to, it's Daryl here.
Hi, Daryl.
No, I tend to be more in a technical science field, which I think I'm a bit safer from the more social field of bias. I haven't come across a lot of it in terms of obvious errors or something. I just haven't experienced that yet. And I have been using it a fair bit, but my questions are sort of technical, and I do use NotebookLM extensively. And yeah, so no, I can't contribute that much to that discussion.
Yes, you don't. I can see Renee's put about using bias mitigating language in your prompts, and yes, it's quite important just to stress that. I mean, one of the most common times we see bias actually is in image generation, and I know Gemini, the team had Gemini and Nano Banana have worked so hard to mitigate that. So, you know, you used to say, show me an image of a naughty teenager, and you get, you know, a boy in a dark hoodie. That sort of stereotypes coming in. And yeah, in subject specific things like marketing, it's really important. It's just fascinating, isn't it, to see how it can creep into the content that comes out.
I think marketing is one of the most disappointing fields of AI.
I mean, I'm not going to get into that, but yeah, I am.
I am just every second example you go to see how they're talking about bloody marketing. I'm over it.
Yeah.
One of the things I would say is asking simply for more responses from AI is one way. Yeah, forcing it away from the average. So if you think about what AI is trained to do, it's trained to give the average response, you know, middle of the road, which sometimes is fine. It's like what you're after. But at other times, you don't want that. You're trying to get variation. So just forcing it to give me 5 responses, give me 5 different examples of something, so that it moves it in different directions. That's one thing. The other thing a lot of people don't realize is a good way of sometimes of getting alternatives is once something like Gemini produces something, if you say that's not what I wanted, you can literally just write that's not what I wanted. It will then obviously think, well, if you don't want that, I'll give you something that's almost the opposite of that. It give us a different version. And often that will then look at something from a different viewpoint or with an image. If it produces a bit, we've seen this a lot in medical work where we get, you know, female pictures of nurses. If we then say to that, "Or I don't want that," the opposite will obviously be a male nurse in the next image. So it will sort of counteract that with the opposite. So,
and the other
and
thing to be aware of is that AI has a tendency to agree with you no matter what. So you can put in "that's wrong," and it will say, "Yeah, you're right, that is wrong." The example that Gemini gave me was, yes, sometimes if you told me the sky was green, I would agree with you. Brilliant.
Yeah. So lots of things coming in the chat by way about bias. People talking about you can ask guys, give the sources we talked about earlier on, the double check responses button, asking questions, what are your assumptions here, what biases have you included in your output, are really nice questions for getting that sort of bias, evidence of that bias true. I must admit, I do think over time, in fact, earlier on when we first launched Bard, the version before Gemini, it was quite easy to almost trick it with questions that you could demonstrate bias. So I could do a demo and I could demo bias by asking certain questions. Now it's much more, it feels like a lot of that has been engineered now to not happen. So it's a lot harder now to get that. Actually, there's a nice feature request coming here. So there is the option to report a response. So if you ever get a response that you think is either factually incorrect or something wrong with that, you can downvote the response, and then you can give the reason why, which means you can say that this is biased in some way. So just picking up on that point now, there is an option. It's like a thumbs up, thumbs down thing, and then when you go into it, it gives you more choices for the reasons why. But you definitely can flag responses.
I've recently worked with a friend who has done a doctorate in neurodiversity and AI, interestingly, and she found that when she told the different AIs that she was autistic, bias crept into their responses, or different ways that affected the response I think she asked the AIs how they felt about her, what they thought about the language she was using, and then she added the comment, "I am autistic, does that change what you are saying?" And that was quite interesting, just that whole neurodivergent lens around it. But yeah, and also the cognitive bias I've seen there as well. Yeah, it's just so important that we're aware of it. So we use something called the AAA framework, just to check and critically evaluate. And again, this is really powerful to train your students. Is the data accurate, aligned, and appropriate? So really, really important. Is it factual? Can you verify it? Does it align with the question in the prompt? Is it relevant? And is it appropriate for your context? So just being aware of that AAA framework. And again, we'll share these slides afterwards, so you can look through them at your own pace. You can make sure you've got them for your reference. So I just think that's really important that we're aware of that. I'm going to move on now because I know that you're all waiting for the NotebookLM section. So we're just going to bring in transforming materials, we've called this section, which is just all the different ways we can use NotebookLM to share data, to explore data, and to pull data to pieces. So this is going to be a whole session on NotebookLM now. So Google have produced a lot of marketing material about NotebookLM, but the key piece is that unlike Gemini, it does not search the web for its answers. It searches the sources that you have given it. So that key phrase there is the sources. You give it sources, or you can search the web to populate sources. But I would imagine in an academic institute, you would be wanting to choose your own sources that align with what you're trying to get out of it. And then it's got the Gemini large language model behind it. So it's trained in terms of understanding language, but it references and explicitly uses the sources that you've given it. You've obviously, when you use NotebookLM, so you can see that image there, you've got your sources panel, and then you've also got a chat panel, which just like Gemini, you can ask questions and it will look at the sources to answer the questions. And then the studio, and we'll go into detail about these sections in a moment, but just to make sure that you understand, for me as a teacher, one thing I love about NotebookLM is that it is multilingual. So I can put in my sources in English, my first language, and I can get my studio to generate information in another language, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So I can create a short explainer video for my Polish student who doesn't speak very good English. So yeah, that's just useful things to know about it. So there's a little timeline here of how NotebookLM works, and you can see you can create your own notebook. I'm going to sort of skim through these files and then actually show you all these things rather than spend ages letting you stare at slides that you can look at later in your own time. But just so we're aware, as we said before, notebook, you can see here, you give your notebook a name, upload your sources, You can search for extra sources, and then you've got your question section, your studio section, and your share section. Just like Gemini, NotebookLM has just had a facelift, so it has got some slightly different features. So I'm going to just share a different tab here and show you NotebookLM. So as soon as you open a notebook, you're given the choice of, do you want to upload your files, or do you want to search for them? And you can see I've got, again, this Gemini, do a quick search, do a deep research for stuff on the web. I can choose different types of files. So we can do PDFs, images, documents, audio, video, just a bundle of text. As Andy said before, with NotebookLM, if you wanted to, you could join PDFs together to make it a single source. If I added some bits and pieces, then it would start immediately generating a summary in the chat window. One of the things that I quite like now is that you've got some options here to customize your notebook. So you can put a little top on, you can customize the summary if you want. If I go into one that's already been made, so I'm going to hop over to one of my other notebooks. Let's share this tab instead. You can see I've got this configure button, and on there you can see I can choose a little bit of information about how my chat responses appear. So do I want them to be just standard? Do I want them to be a learning guide, or do I want to describe the style I want the responses? You can see here, respond at a PhD student level, respond as an RPG host. And actually, interestingly, I think it's actually taken those examples from the content I've got in my drive, because my notebook has got a D&D notebook LM, and I've got some university level notebook LMs. And again, you can talk about the length. Do you want notebook to give you shorter length, longer length? So you can see here, I've got a notebook LM that's been built. It's got just one source for now, but if I wanted to, I could add more sources just by clicking on that limit. You can see I've got up to 300 sources I can add. On a standard fundamentals account, you'd have 50 sources. Or has that gone up to 100 now, Andy? I lose track.
I think we're still on 50, I think.
I think it's still 50. It keeps changing.
I'll check what you're talking.
Brilliant. So this is a pre-made notebook LM, and it's just got a Air University student policy about AI. So if I wanted to click on it, I can look at this source. I can actually expand the source and go and look at more information about it. I can go back to my list of sources. If I have more than one source, I can decide which sources are being used. And you can see this has given me a summary of it. What I wanted to actually show you now was this studio side of things. So if you've not already seen this, on the studio, these are sort of ways we can summarize the content. I know a lot of people are really big fans of the audio overview because they give you a nice podcast of the conversation. And when you use the audio overviews, you can click on the arrow and you can decide the type of audio overview that you want. And I mentioned before, you've got that option to change the language. As with all AI, it's really important that if you are translating content for a student who doesn't speak English as confidently as other languages, they understand there may be errors and they should check them. So I always make sure it's really important that we stress that when we are changing the language. You can talk about what they focus on, so you can make them focus on specific things. You can change the length. Now, there are 4 different types of format. The most commonly used one is deep dive, and deep dive is particularly interesting because of this feature. So if I come down here, I'm going to just quickly play one of my deep dive conversations so you can see the style of it. Hopefully this comes through.
Imagine walking into a classroom or maybe your office on your very first day.
Yeah.
You sit down at your desk, you're totally ready to get to work, and you're informed that you have a new mandatory partner for all.
Now, what's important about this one is you can see this little interactive icon. You will only get that at the moment if you do a deep dive in English language. And the interactive icon means that I can ask a question of the podcast host. I'm actually going to cheat and get a question from down here. So I'm just going to ask a question. Hopefully it'll work for me today. So I press play.
Imagine walking into, oh, hey, I think our listeners got something to say.
What are the rules for brainstorming and original thought? It's decided not to work for me today, of course, because I'm demoing.
An original thought. That is exactly what Air University is trying to save, isn't it?
It really is. It is the heart of this entire policy.
I love that you brought that up because it really frames our whole conversation today.
What is fascinating here is
So you can see you've got that option there to interrupt and ask questions of it. So if I make that smaller again, I really love the audio out overviews. And then you've got sort of these different options, and you can see the different ones we've got there. So a slide deck, and again, as with everything, it's really important that you check it. So if I scroll down to the bottom here, you can see I've got my slide deck with some really cool pictures and infographics built through that explain the policy in a more interesting manner, and I can export that into different formats. And I can now, I didn't used to be able to, but now I can revise it and make edits if there is an error on it. Video overview, same kind of thing. And just like with the audio overview, you can go in, you can change the style, you can change, I'll see the language option now, it seems to disappear again. You can change what it specifically focuses on. So you've got that option there. And then one that I really like is that mind map option. I'm not going to do them live because they do take a while to first load, but I've got here, for example, a mind map. And what I like about the mind maps is this idea that when you, as you go into the different steps, you can see it corresponds in the chat and it gives you that information. So if I, for example, go into approved tools, it will then go into the information, it will answer the question, and it will also reference where it's found that information. So anything that's asked in the chat, you'll see here, I've got my reference point, so I can go across and see where that's come from in the shared sources and what specific area that's taken that information from. And I really love that. So this mind map directly links to the chat, which directly links to the original sources. So I really, really find that powerful. If I carry on down, I've got reports, so I can get some overview information. You can see I've got different types of reports, including study guides. So obviously that's really useful for your students. You can share content, share all your slides from a term and let them make their own study guides. One of the nice things as well about NotebookLM is if you are using Google Classroom, you can create a notebook directly from Google Classroom and select the sources that you've shared in Google Classroom to generate that. But yeah, you can see there's different types of report we can generate. Flashcards to do quizzes, infographics, all these different things. So I don't have any flashcards pre-generated, and data tables. And what's interesting with NotebookLM is it's obviously still a relatively new tool. It's only a year and a bit old, and that means it's constantly getting new and exciting features. So I'm always amazed by the different things you can do with it and the different ways you can use it. So sort of that's a very quick summary of NotebookLM. I'm just trying to glance through my notes here to remember what else I was going to say about it, because I know there were other things. So yeah, I've got one.
Should we include video summaries, Kat?
Oh, yeah. Do you want me to show one? I think I've got one here.
Yep.
There we go. I'm so organized.
The modern academic environment now operates under a clear and undeniable expectation. Artificial intelligence is an essential collaborator. Air University relies on this collaboration to prepare students for the future workforce, while enforcing strict ethical boundaries to protect original thought.
So you can see you've also got the option for letting NotebookLM Gemini know this is a good video, this is a bad video. And there are a few more options, so you can download that video to embed it in a website or share it directly. And then you can share the link to the video, which will link to the notebook. So just useful to know those bits and pieces. I'm going to hop over onto one of my other notebooks. So this one.
Before you hop over, Kat, question from the chat. Could you share what prompt you use for that? I'm guessing to create the video. So do you want to just share about how you prompt the video in a bit more detail?
So for the video, let me just, if I click on the video link here, you can see that it gives me the options to choose the style of video. And then it is just a case of either it will give you a generalized video, or you can explicitly ask it to lean it towards a particular area. And actually what I find quite useful is that you can use the mind map. So that the mind map I showed earlier, that was just a general mind map. I just clicked the mind map generation button. But you can focus on the mind map, but then the mind map can give me areas for what I need to focus on. So it can give you a sort of overview. Oh, actually, can you create a video about security and privacy? Can you create a video about academic integrity? or even go down, can you give me a video about no sensitive personal data? So you can really sort of break it down using the different tools and combining those different tools. And all of those options, all 9 of those options are available as part of the studio for a notebook that you've created. So it's not something complex to find. It's not something you need to upgrade to get. You've got access to all of those tools. And if you want to, you can just click on the button and it will generate. So if I clicked on quiz, for example, it would generate an overview quiz of everything. And it's only if you want to customize it that you need to go into that icon. So if you customize it, you can see, you can ask it to do more questions, fewer questions. So it's really nice and simple to do. And it just gives you another way to look at information, to get that information, to get that data. So I just see I've got some examples I can use in my demo notebook. So for example, here, if I share this tab instead and drop in this question. So I need to use Gemini to help draft the annual department budget report, look at this policy, what are the specific rules regarding human in the loop? So it's just a really simple question there that brings it back to what am I using this for? So I've got the staff policy. I'm using that policy document to answer this question. And you can see again, as I said before, it's now gone through and it's referencing. This is where that information comes from over in the side panel, and I can extract it and I can look at more information about where it's come from. So I think that's really useful to know about. And then I've also got one that I actually use a lot. So as a teacher, every year from the government, we get something called the Keeping Children Safe in Education Guide. And so you get a new one each year and you have to update it. And I'm sure the same is true of policies with you. So if I share this one in, you can see I've got staff and student policies. This time I've got 3 sources in this notebook, and I want to compare and contrast them. So you can see, compare the student policy and staff policies, look at how unauthorized assistance is defined and see if there's any differences. So you can check whether or not the student and staff policies are similar or whether you've got any discrepancies. And you can see that that NotebookLM now is just scanning through all 3 of those resources to make sure it's giving you the correct information using those sources. So I'll go back to my previous one so I can just check, and you can see, there we go. So it's now gone through and you can see it's identified a few bits and pieces. There are notable discrepancies in how it's defined, and it's important to update that. So you can see there that I've now found an error in my 2 different policies, and that's really useful, really powerful way to use it. I'm going to pop back to the slides now so you can see, check I've not missed anything important. So as I said, that's the outline of NotebookLM. You can see that there are lots of different types of files that you can put into NotebookLM to get different style of things out. So I've shown you that. I've shown you the audio overviews. We talked about the fact that you can only do the interactive mode because it's a beta on an English deep dive. The video overview. So all this is obviously for you to look at afterwards. And in fact, we've included step-by-steps on how to do the video overview. So you can see here, we've got that option. You add your sources. Oh, we have a question. Hong, did you want to ask a question?
Hi, yes, thank you very much. I want to ask the question about how to make NotebookLM responses less likely to hallucinate, because I saw the comment by Andrew saying that we need to explicitly ask it to do so. So I'd like to know how exactly should we ask NotebookLM to do that? Thank you.
I think I was answering the question, I think, about biases. Was it about biases, I think? Just
Yes.
check my question. Yeah, so somebody was asking about I'm trying to find my answer now for lots of questions. Oh yes, the question was, yeah, is there any way of flagging biases? And I think what I said was there's no way. Firstly, obviously, NotebookLM is based on your source documentation, and therefore anything that bias might exist in your source documentation could feed through into the notebook. That was the first thing. That was a question, and then I asked, you could ask it to identify whether that source documentation contained any biases. It will be able to compare the documentation against normality. So you could ask it the question: does this source, or will this source documentation lead to any biases? And it depends on the documents you're using, but that's possible.
Yeah. So does that mean that we have to select the open web search for it able to, cross-check with other documents?
No, so you talk about when you're adding sources in.
Yes.
Yeah, you don't need to the open web search there is looking at when it's finding documents, is it allowed to go wider? When NotebookLM is responding in the chat pane in the middle area, it will only respond from the documentation you've given it. So it won't respond if you haven't given it information on topic, it won't respond. So that isn't giving NotebookLM like web access, it's just using web to find more sources to potentially bring in as an information source.
Yeah. So would you be confident to say that NotebookLM is much less likely to hallucinate the responses compared to other AI?
It's less likely to hallucinate, less likely to have biases, because it all depends what you put in, doesn't it? But I would say it's less likely to do both because you're responsible. You're grounding it in your own documentation and you're grounding it in your own material. And that's why I think it's less likely to do so.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to point out, so what we're talking about mostly is when you're adding your own sources that you've created, and that obviously is any bias that's in there has come from your own content. But as I mentioned, one way that you can generate a notebook is to search the web for sources, and then obviously bias can creep in because you're searching the whole web for notebook to get the sources that it's using, if that makes sense. So for example, if I wanted to create a notebook about computer architecture, create a notebook about computer architecture, you can tell I'm a computer science teacher, can't you? And then it will search and research the website, just like a Google search would do, to find websites that it thinks are relevant. And again, it's up to you as the user to do due diligence and check, are these websites actually relevant? So I can view the websites, I can then have a look at them and see, do I think these websites are relevant for me? So you can see it's got quantum von Neumann architecture and things like that. So I can decide whether or not I want to import all of those or not and use them. So if I did, I could import them all and it will generate a notebook from them. Does that help a little bit?
Yes, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's nice to have questions, actually. So yeah, just for your own reference, obviously, this slide will help you know how to create a video. Although I've just realized I think this is the old layout and it's updated since then because we love a good update. But that's fine. I mean, as I said, Google, this, I think it was last week, both Gemini and NotebookLM had a facelift. So things may look slightly different, but generally things are roughly the same. And obviously I showed the mind map, and you can see, you can also make the mind maps full screen. But I quite like using it alongside the chat so I can sort of get more information and find out more content where its references come from and all the rest of it. And as I said, there are lots of different versions, things like the study guides. So we've got to a nice pause point for some questions. Obviously, you've already asked loads of questions, but if there are any more, now is a good opportunity to chat. Again, as always, feel free to type your answers, or if you want to jump in and shout out loud, because I think it's Andy's turn to take over.
Yeah, so just sort of picking up at this point, we'll do the questions first, Kat. A couple of questions coming in the chat. We may as well both do these. So is there any application at Google, Google Workspace that you can use to create in an automated way slides or Google presentations? So I would, in terms of creating in an automated way, that Workspace Studio at this point can create docs but not slides. So I would say we couldn't automate the process in Workspace Studio at this point. So that wouldn't automate. You could use Gemini. Gemini will create slides but won't automate. So I think there's probably a missing step in this loop here. Possibly watch this space on Workspace Studio might be an answer for that at this point. I'm trying to think, could you automate the flow in Gemini, but not yet. A lot of the answers to your questions are sort of coming soon in various updates, but right now, could you automate slide creation? No, you'd have to manually run it through. What you could do is use a gem to design the slide style you want and put the content in that way. So there's ways of getting close, but not full automation is the answer for, I think, for Ralph.
I'm going to share, Andy, Eileen's asked about the different uses of Gemini in different versions. I'm going to share, actually, Andy's made a resource about this because so many people ask. So I'll just drop that in the chat now.
Yeah, I made a web page that just showed the different features. However, everything we've demonstrated today in Gemini and NotebookLM is effectively in our fundamentals in our free version. Where you see variations, it's often in the amount that you can use a product. So if I give the example of Workspace Studio, you obviously each time you run a flow, you're running an automation. You can only run that a certain number of times on our fundamentals account, then our Education Plus account, which is our first paid tier, allowed to use it more, and then our AI Pro licenses can use it more. So often it's around those sort of limits rather than limits to access product. In Notebook, it's the number of sources. There are some changes, but nothing major. But that is a sort of quick answer to that. And then that table that I made shows all the breakdown of features in Google and what editions they sit in. So thank you for sharing that, Kat. Then lots of questions coming in now. I have a couple of issues. Dynamic mind map embedded into Google's sites, and summary of web page versus website, just the page. So these are, I think, NotebookLM questions, Kat.
Yep.
So we do. Can you embed the mind map?
Yes, I don't actually know the answer to that one because it's not something I've tried.
The answer is you currently can't. You can currently can't export it as where it's interactive. So you can export it where it's sort of static but not interactive. This is a slight workaround at this point, but you could take the static image, put it back into Gemini and ask Canvas to make it interactive. So there is a sort of a workaround, but it's not officially sort of the best route to go down. That's that. Summary of web page versus website. Just the page.
It says website, but it actually means web page. You're right. So when you're doing your sources, it's important that you include every single page that is relevant. So that does mean you have to click into each page to get that data. And Doc, you've just asked if the presentation and slide deck, yes, they will be available afterwards. Fear not.
Somebody's answered question 3, which is what aspects of your workload could you augment with AI as being freshness of research finding in sensitive topics? And actually, there is that's really looking at the research and deep research into Notebook that could be really useful in that space, particularly if you teach a topic that changes a lot or is moving in nature. Then we've got going down the list, someone who's in K-12, so in the school sector, has asked, teacher dashboarding gems and NotebookLM will be a huge help to know through plans like this. So this is, I think, asking the question around teachers being able to view what their students are doing. So everything you do inside Google is tracked in a product called Google Vault. So there is a product called Vault that's sort of monitoring what's happening. But at this point, the sort of people who have access to that, normally administrators, people with access to the back end of your admin console. So there is a level of audit there, but not the level I think that Renee's asking for. What I would suggest is to feature request that through. There's been a few requests for that. I've met people who want that. So I think it's a very valid request to ask for that. So I don't know if there are plans to develop it, but I do know the more things get feature requested, the more likely Google are to build it, which basically means put a feature request in. And Daryl says, thanks. So where are we at? Okay.
Take back slide control, or do you want me just to flick through?
Yeah, now we can go through from where you are. Keep your control at your end. So thank you for those questions. Keep them coming as we wrap on this session shortly. Just want to give an overall sort of summary of where we're at in terms of Google's position at the moment. Google, as you've probably seen through lots of the topics we talked about today, believes in developing AI for the use of higher education as being a responsible use of the tool, and doing that in partnership. And that's one of the reasons why we keep talking about giving feedback and looking at the way the products are structured moving forward. Needs to both meet those responsible uses of AI, but also be based around the needs of the users. So lots of things you're asking for today. I definitely recommend you press the question mark button on and feed those into Google as some feedback of something you would like it to have happen. So feed those through. There are a range of next slide, Kat. There are a range of resources. I'm going to spend a little bit of a moment just looking into some of these now. I'll let you drive the screen if you're all right. That you might want to use when we talk about introducing different areas of AI and some of the areas where Google are testing things. So we start with experiments, Kat, is that right? So sometimes before Google launches a product, it will launch what we call an experiment. And these are a place where if you want to see what's sort of coming with Google, you can look at some of the different tools bringing forward. And actually everything sort of starts off in this phase often and then moves out to either be a feature inside Gemini or a feature inside of the tools. And it's interesting as we watch these flick through, isn't it, Kat? Do you want to just about how some of these are almost answers to questions that people have already asked for? Do you want to go back one? Now, not all of these are available in all markets of the world, and some of them are limited access, so you can sign up if you're on a wait list. But just going back one, Kat, I know that Pamela is creating on-brand marketing content for your business. Someone has already asked, I know, a question today around why can't all the slides be on brand and be perfectly aligned to the style that we want at our university. So as you can see, Google are building a range of tools here in lab state that might build into those sort of tools. So if you're looking for sort of what's coming next, Google Flow is another one which sort of builds matching imagery. So if you've sort of seen some of our video creation tools, every video is different. But what Flow is able to do is keep consistency between either image or video creation to keep consistent areas. So on this page, Google Labs is the place where we sort of Google is developing new tools, and you can definitely use that to sort of see what's upcoming. And have a play with some of the features in that space and get an idea what might be coming next. So Labs is definitely worth a look. We can go back to your list. Let's also look at Teachable Machine next. Teachable Machine has been around for some time and was really created to enable us to teach people about how we might train tools. It uses a low level of artificial intelligence, but I know it's easy when you try to explain to people how it might work. The concept of capturing content to then
This is an
predict what's gonna
experiment that
happen.
lets you explore how machine learning works. You can teach the machine using your camera and make it respond to you in fun ways. First, you'll have to turn on your camera. Go ahead and click Allow.
We're on there. That's the introduction to Teachable Machine, but effectively what it does is it teaches you about how AI can be trained. So effectively you turn on your camera and you input different colors, items of those colors, and there I've got the orange lying around.
Okay,
but then
over here is your input. You should see yourself. Over here are 3 classes.
I'll stop
We've
it
lost
sharing
it.
that.
Yeah, we've lost your screen there, Kat.
Got overexcited, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I'll pop my slides in. So Teachable Machine is a nice way if you're working with trying to explain the concepts of, bring my screen back in, explain the concepts to users. So that's Teachable Machine experiments. We've also got the work that we're doing with Raspberry Pi and DeepMind to create resources to teach people about AI, and those are a series of resources called Experience AI. Experience AI is a series of lessons you can use. They're not focused on one AI tool, so it talks about AI generically, but there's a range of content in there looking at foundations of AI, AI safety, how we solve problems with AI, how large language models works, and then into down some subject specific lessons. So there's a range of resources there if you're working developing content. Let's see, so we'll come back on that in a second. And then we now have got a new project here, and we'll share the slides afterwards, looking at AI literacy for everyone and what that means. So it's another variation on that, producing a series of resources powered by MITRAYS to look at how to deliver more AI literacy to people in the wider community. So those resources are available there. So that's a question I'd like to talk about literacy insights. Is that in, where is literacy? It might be useful if you give us a link to that so we can know, is that an experiment? I don't know off the top of my head, Kat, I don't know if it's an experiment. I'm not sure.
I think it was probably in the experiments. I can.
Let me just check in experiments to see if it's in there.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Yeah, it's one of the experiments. labs.google.com/science.
There it is. Yeah. So all of the experiments are focused, are almost little beta tests. So what you will find here is some examples of, in this case, AI AI-powered scientific discovery, sorry. And these are focused around NotebookLM. So what you'd have to do, I don't think I've got access to this yet, which is true, I haven't. No, I've expressed interest, but I haven't got access yet. Is it's effectively, let's have a look at let's go into video.
No sound, Andy.
Hmm?
No sound coming from
No
that.
sound. Sorry, apologies. And no sound coming through that. I will share my tab in with sound so we can see the brief introduction to that piece. Give me 1 second. I'll have to reshare my screen as a tab. That one there, I think. Yes. Okay. And with audio this time, here we go.
Understanding scientific literature is a core part of all research journeys. With the power of NotebookLM, Literature Insights helps me synthesize findings across papers and identify research gaps, ultimately accelerating my research workflows. Engineering immune cells to attack cancer is one of the most promising frontiers in oncology. Designing CAR T cell receptors to specifically target cancer cells requires synthesizing vast amounts of complex data. To start, I can search through literature to gather publications on cancer surface proteins. The sources I select are compiled into a dynamic data table. Using custom data extraction, the agent creates new columns, instantly pulling out complex metrics like surface localization, tumor specificity, and antigen density, allowing me to rigorously compare the scientific data side by side. Next, a literature review report is automatically generated, with strict inline citations linked directly back to the original text. Finally, I can chat with the agent to analyze the literature deeper, and open the Studio panel to generate a variety of artifacts ranging from slide decks to mind maps to an audio overview or infographic. From structural biology to targeted oncology to gene therapy and beyond, Literature Insights can accelerate understanding across any complex scientific domain. Use Literature Insights to synthesize large volumes of research into clear scientific insights.
So it seems to be almost a custom NotebookLM, where some of the content, I would say, is pre-populated and perhaps goes in more depth than we could from the slide deck. So that's a good example of something that's an experiment that Google are moving towards. And obviously, I imagine if you've been on the link already, that someone has dropped in the chat, thank you. You could join a waitlist for that. And it's thinking about the potential of some of these areas. And I think for that one, the potential about sharing existing content. You might have seen that NotebookLM now has an ability to share between different users, but there are also public notebooks available where you can go onto a notebook that's pre-populated, and this feels like a variation on a pre-populated notebook. But thank you for asking about that. Good question. I'm just going to go back in and grab my slides back in to begin the wrap. We're almost at the time now. So I'm just going to finish the wrap and talk about what's coming next. Kat, do you want to pop a link back into the form? Because while we're going to the close, people might want to fill the form in.
I've dropped in the form for certification, but I will also drop in the feedback form as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, Kat. So we got our 2 forms in. So we've talked about the learning resources for...
Oh, that's the same one twice. Ignore me. Managed to copy the same one in twice.
We've answered any remaining questions there might be. But this is one of a series of webinars. So this is the final set of 3 Gemini Academies we've run. The recording for this session and the previous 2 sessions, my colleagues Steve and Louise will be available to watch on our site. We also run a series of live edu-on-airs across the year. You can have both access to the previous sessions, and we have more coming up as the year progresses. So Gemini Academy, which is our Gemini focus session, and edu-on-air are available to support you as we go throughout the year. So those are both available. It would be great to get your feedback on what we've covered in today's session and any previous sessions you've attended on the feedback form. We still didn't receive previous attended. I'll have a look into the form and check find out whether any certificates have been sent. Those are those. Other than that, a big thank you, Kat, for joining me today to share NotebookLM, and thank you all for joining me today. We'll hang around in the last few minutes to answer any further questions. But other than that, a big thank you and take care, everyone. See you all soon.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Daryl.
Thank you, Daryl. Take care.
I've got to go to bed now.
Yeah, no worries. You
Bye.
go to bed, and thanks for sharing, Daryl.
That's right. See you later. And
See you
yes, and I
later.
will join your subsequent meetings
Mhm.
or your webinars.
Take care.
Thanks a
Daryl.
lot.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you, everybody. Nadia, thank you.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Give a bit of time for people to do the feedback.
Mhm. Yeah, we're looking into the form. Thank you. And we'll see why the certificates haven't gone out yet.
Stop recording. Okay.
Okay.